Galatians 3 verse 1 is absolutely loaded with passion in the heart of Paul. He starts off by saying, "Oh, foolish Galatians." And so many times when we read that, we just read it with so much passion in churches where he said, "You stupid Galatians, you foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" Now, let us just read that passage in Galatians 3 verses 1. It says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth, crucified amongst you?" Now that is, there's so much power in that passage because Paul has actually got a reference to this bewitching. And he comes and he says to the Galatians, "Who has bewitched you?" Or actually what he's saying there is, who has come and indoctrinated you with rebellion or with bitterness or from a foundation of bitterness. And this we find in 1 Samuel 15 verse 23. I want to read 1 Samuel 15 verse 22 and 23. It says, "And Samuel said, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness as the iniquity of adultery. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." Now, what's happening here, we can clearly see that Paul comes and, in my mind, is having this passage in mind. He's coming and he's saying, and in his mind, this is what I think is going on in his mind, he's thinking of Saul that would not do what the prophet told him to do, would not do what God told him to do, and then he was actually falling back to the law and try to do greater favors and bring great gifts according to the law and bring animals that he was not supposed to bring as spoils of the war, and he did bring them in. And the reason why he was bringing that in was so that he could continue with a sacrificial system. And then Samuel comes and he says, what's better, to continue in the sacrificial system or to have sacrifices or to obey the voice of God? And then he says here that rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So we find here that this rebellious system, when you come and you rebel against something, there is a bewitching power in that. So what he is actually saying is, and I'm going to use my own words, which people that are rebelling against the true word of God has come to bewitch you or to bring you under the power of their own bitterness and their own rejection and their own stubbornness. Who has done that? And then whenever Paul quotes verses, we know that when he quotes a small part of a verse, he's actually got the whole passage in mind. And what he's got in mind, we can see in the rest of Galatians as well, that he is afraid, and we're going to see this in chapter 3 as well, that they would fall away. And here we can see that when Saul came and he was in rebellion against the word of God and actually went to the sacrificial system, which fits what the Gentiles are doing in Galatia perfectly, because what they are doing is they believe in Jesus, they obey the voice, they hear what the truth is, and then they actually push that truth away and go back to a sacrificial system. They go back to the Jewish system. They go back to the customs of Moses, including circumcision. And Paul comes and he says, who has bewitched you? This whole thing that has come over you is on account of someone that is stubborn, and that is idolatry, and someone that is actually in rebellion or in bitterness towards what God is truly doing. And that's where he starts off in chapter 3. And then he comes and he explains, he says, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth? Can you see there the bewitching? And then going back to 1 Samuel there, 15 verse 23, where it was all about rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. So the rebellion that you are under, there's a bewitching power by that rebellion. Or you can also say that it is a bewitching. It's like a curse that's over you that causes you to rebel against. So what he's coming and he's saying is the people that are speaking to you is influencing you in a negative way, and they are not obeying the truth. So just by his first statement there, Galatians 3 verse 1, he says, O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? By that he is saying, O foolish Galatians, those who are bewitching you are disobedient to the truth. It is a witchcraft. It is like idolatry. And then he goes on, and in his mind, in that passage there, he's talking about the whole thing about Saul being rejected now as king. I want to read that again. In verse 23, it says, For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, obeyed not the truth, he has also rejected you from being king. So what's happening here is, and Paul goes on in his writing in chapter 3, and he's actually saying, listen, if you are going back to Judaism, you will not be standing under grace anymore. And that's not because God is rejecting people. That is simply because the law is not of faith. It's not the same system. They are not in competition with one another. The law cannot give life, and we will still see that later on in chapter 3. Neither can it be compared to the grace of God. It's a completely different system. And what you would do is you would step away from the truth. Now he goes on in the second part of the verse. He said here, before whose eyes Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth and crucified amongst you. Now that is a very difficult English translation of actually saying that when Christ was preached to you and when he was hanging on the cross, and if you really understand what was going on there, and I think he's pointing out especially when Christ was preached, it says that Jesus Christ has been evidently set forth as crucified amongst you. He says that there were evidence, that Paul provided evidence when he started the churches in Galatia. Solid evidence that Christ was not crucified just for the Jews, but that he was also crucified amongst the Gentiles. So you must remember, the Gentiles believed that only the Jews had a Messiah. They had no Messiah. They were without God in the world, and they had no hope of any form of salvation from oppression or sin or death or whatsoever. Now that was not in reality true. That was true as pertaining to the law, because we know that God is the God of both the Jew and the Gentile. But should we put the glasses of the law on and look through the law, we would see Gentiles are without God and only the Jews really have the true God, which provides a Messiah. So from this perspective, Paul is writing, and he is saying, listen, we have now come and we have portrayed Christ not only as the Messiah of the Jews, but that he was also crucified amongst you as what he was crucified amongst the Jews, simply meaning that Christ came as the Messiah for you people also. Now, in order to understand the evidence that Paul was bringing forth here, you have to make a study of Romans chapter 1 from verse 18 onwards up to the end of chapter 2. Especially from 18 to the beginning of chapter 2, you will see that Paul comes and he declares that the Gentiles were sinners because they went and worshipped creation rather than the Creator, didn't believe in God. And then he goes on to chapter 2, and after declaring the Gentiles as sinners, he now moves on to the Jews and has his shot at the Jews. And he says to the Jews, you are as much sinners as the Gentiles because you received the law, but you didn't even obey the law. And then by making the Jew and declaring the Jew a sinner and the Gentile a sinner, he comes then and says that Christ was made sin and he came for sin, and therefore when Jesus died, he died for sinners. And since the Jew and the Gentile are both sinners, it means that Christ was as much crucified amongst the Gentiles as what he was amongst the Jews. Paul says this because he says, you guys are now hearing a message and you're not following the truth. And the message you are hearing is that Christ was only crucified for the Jews and not for you as well. Now you want to become a Jew by being circumcised and following the customs of Moses so that you can benefit from the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And he says, those who are bringing that to you, they are actually in rebellion against the truth, and that God is not backing that word. Well, that is Galatians 3 verse 1.